is Dracula, a sorcerer formerly known as Vlad Tepes, whose practices of demonic rituals have been causing trouble for the people of Wallachia in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately for them, he sold his soul to the devil in exchange for incredible dark power, and unleashes demons upon the land to spread his darkness. 4 heroes step up to stop Dracula: Sifo Belnades, a monk who has powerful magical abilities; Grant Dynasty, a rebel who seeks revenge on Dracula for turning him into a monster and killing his friends; Adrian Fahrenheit Tepes, son of Dracula, whose soul was also a part of Dracula's pact with the devil, also turning him into a vampire. Rebelling against his father's evil ambitions, he changes his name to Alucard and joins the fight. And finally, Trevor Belmont. Hailing from a powerful family of vampire killers, he takes up his mystical whip to take Dracula down. This is Dracula's castle, sometimes known as Castlevania, the home base of demons and other creatures of the night under Dracula's control. The 4 heroes overcome this castle and face off against Dracula, killing him and putting an end to this long night for Wallachia. But this is a sad moment for Alucard. Forced to kill his own father, he decides to exile himself into a deep sleep. But Trevor and Sifo fall in love, and in their union bring honor back to the Belmont name, which carries on for generations. But as long as evil exists in the heart of men, there's always a way for Dracula to return, and the cycle continues. Every 100 years, he's revived into the world, hoping to pick back up his conquest. But there's always a Belmont to put him back in the ground. Like Simon Belmont, who defeated Dracula, got stricken with a deadly curse, found Dracula's scattered body parts, revived him, and then killed him again to break that curse. What a Chad. Up to now, I've covered all the classic Castlevania games, so in this video, we turn to the next era of the series, starring Simon's descendant, Richter Belmont, who kicks off a story arc that changes Castlevania forever.
Welcome to Mentoktober.
Dracula, der Fürst der Finsternis, Herr des Teufelsschlosses, ist auferstanden.
Hell yeah, this is Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which opens with just a vibe. A fully German narration as it shows that evil men once again make a blood sacrifice to the devil to revive Dracula. After 100 years, he's risen again, this time in the year 1792, 100 years after Simon Belmont last defeated him. Yes, 1792, so don't worry about these knights in the intro that look like they just left the Crusades. Maybe they decided to revive Dracula in their Halloween costumes, who knows. So with the demons unleashed upon the world again, it's up to 19-year-old Richter Belmont to take up his family's whip to save his kidnapped girlfriend Annette and vanquish Dracula. And the game opens with this gorgeous sequence of Richter riding through the forest on horse and carriage toward the castle while death looms in the background. And after a brief fight, Death chooses to deal with Richter later, and the game begins with, I think, the best depiction of the surrounding towns being attacked by Dracula's forces so far. We normally hear about the havoc his demons are causing in passing, but here there's a whole intro of villagers being attacked, and in the first level, skeletons are jumping out of windows while the whole area burns. It's also cool because stage 1 is a callback to Simon's quest, with the village of Algiba being under attack. All while we hear divine bloodlines in the background, flexing the guitars overlaid to that typical Castlevania sound. If all of this looks like a huge technical upgrade over Super Castlevania 4, that's because Rondo of Blood is the first game in the series to be made for a CD format. That's why everything looks so much more colorful and alive. Officially called Akumajo Dracula X Chi no Rondo, the game was released exclusively in Japan in October of 1993 for NEC's PC Engine. And once again, the game is divided into stages mostly taking place within Dracula's castle. There are 9 stages with 4 hidden alternate routes, so it'll take multiple playthroughs to see everything hidden within the game. Many of the levels will be familiar to you if you've played previous Castlevania titles, and I have to give credit to this series for the consistency of the castle itself. So there's always these familiar elements with each Castlevania title, like walking through the entranceway while being overrun by zombies, or having to climb the clock tower, which leads to Dracula's Keep, which has the same set of stairs and throne room. It's always done in this way that doesn't get stale, and this game is no different. So you begin playing as Richter, who goes through the classic Castlevania loop. Fight through the stage, get to the end of a stage, defeat a boss, and progress. But after all the quality of life changes from Super Castlevania 4, Richter feels sometimes like a bit of a step back. Gameplay mechanic wise, I would describe Rondo of Blood as playing almost exactly like the original Castlevania. That means Richter's whip can no longer be pointed in any direction, which makes enemies much more annoying. That wind-up delay Simon had in the first game is replicated here, but it feels like it takes Richter so much longer to swing this thing. So once again, the sub-weapons you collect along the way will be doing a lot of the heavy lifting. The classic Belmont sub-weapons return, like the knife, axe, cross, and holy water. I always love the visual improvement to when you throw the holy water here, it's pretty damn cool. But Richter has a new sub-weapon at his disposal this time, the Holy Bible.
This covenant of blood.
Nothing like the word of God to make these demons cower in. Oh, I've never seen a Bible do that. Aside from that, Richter is still a slow-trekking, whip-cracking badass like his predecessors. And for what it's worth, you don't have to upgrade the whip anymore, as it's in its chain form the entire game. Even his jump mechanics feel less forgiving. And this all makes Rondo of Blood, to me, one of the most difficult games in the series. However, it is one of the best looking ones. But along the way, Richter will save multiple maidens who were also kidnapped by Dracula. One of them is 12-year-old Maria Renard,
Who are you, mister? A good guy?
who tells Richter that she comes from a family of vampire killers. Unbeknownst to them, Maria is a distant relative of the Belmonts. But the cutscene ends with her asking to go along with Richter.
I came here to beat some bad men.
An idea he finds laughable. But he does not know how much he's underestimating this girl, because once you free her, she's playable. And if you use her, it's like playing this game on easy mode. In fact, it feels like a totally different game sometimes. Because she can summon animals to fight for her, her normal attack uses these doves with little to no cooldown, so spamming this will cover her ass a majority of the time. But she can also whip out cats, cardinals, and dragons. Maria can even slide and double jump. I know she's famously broken as a playable character in this game, but it's no exaggeration. I found playing this much more enjoyable when using her. Because with Richter, I was afraid to even jump at times, knowing I'm practically a sitting duck in air. Even with me saying this, I won't call this game unfun or unfair, because it's well made, and a very faithful successor to the original Castlevania. You're meant to learn the attack patterns of your enemies and respond. You're meant to be easily crushed and defeated, because the next time you play that stage, whether you realize it or not, you start playing better and better. Granted, that's how video games worked in the 80s and 90s, but Rondo of Blood makes overcoming each stage feel very satisfying. Not to mention, this is an extremely flashy game. Look at these special moves called item crashes. Every single sub-weapon in this game has a hidden power that can be unleashed if you have enough hearts, including Maria's animal sub-weapons. And I feel these were put in the game just to flex from an artistic perspective. But it's not just the item crashes, the backgrounds, the colors, even down to the enemy design. Many of these enemies were so good, they would just be copied and pasted into future games. And the bosses all have that drip. Like this werewolf boss in stage 2, who gets this really detailed intro animation while howling in the background. This is great. This is peak right here. Carmilla from Simon's Quest makes a return as a boss, with her revealing herself in her classic mask form before it turns into a skull and her actual body emerges on top of it. This is how you do a callback and elevate it. And despite my critiques, Rondo of Blood paved the way for modern Castlevania titles, with Toru Hagihara being responsible for the game's direction. Previously, he was a programmer for Belmont's Revenge, and while there's not a lot of behind-the-scenes info on Rondo of Blood, I did find a very zany developer interview with the whole team, which is really wholesome to read, by the way. Akira Soji, nicknamed Akiro Pito, was in charge of sound design and music, and he reveals the most difficult part about making this game was finding the right samples for sound effects, with Dracula's cape being the result of him flailing a blanket around his home, and he recorded it to a cassette tape. He'd also go to many of the staff at Konami to record them doing embarrassing voices and monster noises to include in the game. I was told to make a bunch of embarrassing voices. When it came to recording, I was a deer in headlights. But somehow, before I knew it, we had it all wrapped up and converted to PCM data. Those enemy death cries I made though, that was no joke. They're courtesy of the torture and pain I endured at the hands of Akiro Pito. But hey, it's my big debut. But as I mentioned before, now that the game was on a CD, the team was able to include real instruments in the tracks, which made the entire soundtrack a certified classic. There's also a section in this interview with the character designers who were asked about the most challenging part of developing Rondo of Blood. And they responded, "My laundry piled up. The cat took a shit in my garden. Oh wait, these have nothing to do with the development." Well, as for that, it all went smoothly. The return bus failed to arrive practically every day, and I had to walk home on these scary mountain roads, and I had to eat out every day, which was bad for my health. But I finally found a serious answer from designer Toshiharu Furukawa, who says graphically, we'd always had to hold back on the monsters in previous Castlevania games, because they had to be released in the US. Monsters with a humanoid form violated American morals, but Rondo of Blood was a Japan-only release, so I took the opportunity to create a whole bunch of half human, half monster, and other magical type enemies. I'll be very happy if players notice that. The programmers in this interview also reveal that their first version of the game was easily 5 times more difficult than the one that hit the market. Which at this point, why not? Just release the original cut. Something you'll also notice in this game are these fully animated cutscenes throughout, fully voiced and often showing Richter saving each kidnapped damsel. This art style would be brand new to Castlevania, with a more anime look that was typical of PC Engine games of that time. But both Richter and Maria have their own specific cutscenes in their playthrough, which gives Rondo of Blood quite a bit of replayability, especially if you're looking to 100% it. Not to mention all the usual secrets and hidden paths that are typical in a Castlevania game. Okay, so we return to Richter, who's fighting for his life in here, and partway through the game, we get a cutscene with Dracula approaching Annette, teasing her at the prospect of immortality and eternal beauty, to which she says she'd rather die. But Dracula has an interesting monologue here that discusses what I think to be the core theme of this series, the cycle of evil in the hearts of humanity. He asks Annette what it is about his existence that makes him a savage, if he was the one summoned by men, seeking a new age. Remember this, it will come up later. But after his epic match with Death at the top of a haunted ship, Richter finally gets closer to saving Annette. But she's guarded by Shaft, played by Samuel L. Jackson.
Wrong answer!
I'll never get used to that name. He's the dark priest in charge of the resurrection of Dracula, and why would they put this guy as a boss after Death? I mean, come on. Oh. This guy summons all 4 bosses from the original Castlevania, but they're all epic this time. Look at the glow up on Frankenstein's monster. So after taking them down, only then can you defeat Shaft, and the path to Annette is opened with her being stashed in the clock tower. Richter and Annette have this cute little reunion, so all that's left is dealing with Dracula. Psych! Shaft is vengeful, even in death, with his ghost along with a zombie dragon thing appearing to kill Richter at the end of the level. But once he dies, we reach the final level, and we're greeted with a familiar set of stairs leading to the castle keep. It's time for the final battle. Dracula is still using his old magic tricks from under his cape, so if you've played previous games, you know the drill. Go for the head. But with enough hits, he transforms into this fearsome beast, a callback to the original Castlevania, but Richter is way too powerful and takes him down, leading to this final chat between him and Dracula.
It is by your desires that you humans prosper, and it is your faith which has ruled you. Considering that, can you really call me evil?
But people cannot be ruled by power alone. The sacred, the honorable, the loved, those things can rule humanity. Something evil will eventually fall to ruin!
I see. Perhaps you're right.
I don't know, Dracula had some bars here. And so ends Rondo of Blood, a game that's looked back on fondly in this series. And I'd recommend it as a good starting point if you have any interest in the classic Castlevania formula, especially if you enjoy a good challenge. And though this version never truly came to the West, Rondo of Blood was remade in 1995 for the Super Nintendo, under the name Castlevania Dracula X in North America. Unless you live in Europe, where it was called Vampire's Kiss. Unless you live in Japan, where it was called Akumajo Dracula XX. Yeah, we were 1 X away from a completely different game. So I won't go into crazy detail about Dracula X, but there were enough changes in this version for it to exist as its own thing. The plot received quite a few interesting updates, stating this takes place in medieval Transylvania several hundred years after Simon defeated Dracula. And Dracula is revived and wants revenge on the Belmonts and goes after Richter by kidnapping his girlfriend Annette and her little sister Maria. Yes, the same Maria. So the sister thing is definitely a change in the lore for this game, so people often look at Dracula X as this alternate continuity. But I have to give some love to the updated character artwork for this version, where it starts to get into that gothic style that we see later in the series. Dracula X has mostly the same gameplay as Rondo of Blood, sticking to the same classic mechanics I mentioned before. But unfortunately there's no playable Maria this time. You'll have to stick it out from start to finish as Richter. But I say this game exists on its own because it feels like a trimmed down version of Rondo of Blood. Levels are completely different, many of the bosses have been switched around or no longer appear, including Shaft, which means no mummy, Medusa, or monster summoned. And the other maidens were also cut from the game, with Richter only on a mission to save Maria and Annette. But in this cool twist, if you fail to save Annette, she becomes the boss of the clock tower level, transforming into Carmilla. Otherwise, Death will be here waiting instead. The final fight with Dracula gets quite a change too. I guess Richter pulled up on him while he was in the middle of renovating the floors. So with all these changes, as you can imagine, reviewers gave the game some criticism for not holding up to other Castlevania games, feeling incomplete or like a downgrade to Super Castlevania 4. And I can see why people would feel that way, especially if you didn't get the full package that Rondo of Blood served. Rondo of Blood itself wouldn't get an official international release until 2007, with Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles. This was a title developed for the PlayStation Portable that contained both a remade version of Rondo of Blood, complete with 3D models and a new art direction, and the original version, this time with added English voice acting and an improved script. Dracula X Chronicles also expands the story of the original game, containing more dialogue and fleshing out more plot points surrounding Shaft, or Annette turning into a vampire if Richter fails to save her, which becomes a new added boss. So while Rondo of Blood was the exclusive Japanese Castlevania made in 1993, there was actually another Castlevania being worked on at the same time, and for the first time, Konami would make a Castlevania for a Sega console. Castlevania Bloodlines, or Vampire Killer in Japan. I feel like Konami was just trolling with the names at this point. But story-wise, this one was always interesting to me for two reasons. The first is that this is the first game in the series where they chose not to feature a Belmont as the protagonist. Kinda. The second is that this game is loosely tied to the events of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. Yes, you can associate those events with the Castlevania timeline. Stick with me here. The manual points out that Dracula was living in the Transylvanian countryside again in the year 1897, just another 100 years after Richter defeated him last. And in this time period, it's when the events of the novel take place. If you don't know the story, just know Dracula is a wealthy count who feeds on innocents and turns them into vampires. And a group of people figure out Dracula is demon spawn and choose to hunt him down, namely a professor named Van Helsing, Jonathan Harker, a man who got to spend an unpleasant amount of time in Dracula's castle, and Quincy Morris, a suitor to a woman named Lucy, who is now dead because of Dracula. So when they finally hunt him down, the fatal blow is struck by Jonathan, who decapitates him, and Quincy, who stabs him in the heart. But Quincy dies in the struggle, and the book ends with Jonathan naming his child in Quincy's honor. This little incident fits decently in the timeline, and I think it's a fun connection, though some people don't take it too seriously. But Mentok, how come the Belmonts didn't stop him that time? So here's the twist. Quincy Morris from the novel was a descendant of the Belmont clan, which brings us back to Bloodlines. Taking place in the year 1917, a vampiress named Elizabeth Bartley is brought back to life by a dark sorceress named Drolta Swentes, and the two orchestrate the assassination of the Crown Prince of Austria, which sets off a war of global proportions. Yes, they cause World War I. Elizabeth's goal is to use the souls of the dead from this war to revive her uncle Dracula once again. Enter John Morris and Eric Lacard, descendants of the Belmonts, with John being the son of Quincy from the novel. And he's inherited the whip of the Belmont clan, with this being the first title to officially name it the Vampire Killer. John and Eric set out to drive back the evil in the world, with their first stop being Dracula's castle. That was a good guess. And they're also like super smart because they seem to take the shortcut all the way up to his keep this time, instead of going through all the bullshit that all the rest of the Belmonts did. Despite this, Dracula is nowhere to be found, and realizing he's not the one behind this, they pursue Elizabeth all across Europe. And Elizabeth herself, much like Dracula, is based on a real person from the 1500s. Erzsébet Báthory, a Hungarian noblewoman who is alleged to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Allegedly. I'm here saying allegedly like she's gonna sue me. But she's allegedly responsible for the deaths of at least 80 people before she was arrested and executed. So of course, folklore has sensationalized the details a bit, with the tales saying that she's killed over 600 people and bathed in the blood of children. So she fits right in as the main antagonist of this game. And this would be the final game in the Castlevania series to take the stage-by-stage approach, and playing this right after Rondo of Blood was kinda refreshing. I'm not bashing that game, but John and Eric moved so much faster than Richter. Maybe it's that blast processing I've been hearing about. But this was intentional from the development team, as they wanted a more unique Castlevania game that was fast and action-packed. And while called Castlevania Bloodlines, this was officially seen as a spin-off for the series in Japan. I can understand why they would call it one, but at its core, this game is very much Castlevania, even down to the sound. With this being the first time veteran composer for the series, Michiru Yamane, would compose for a Castlevania game. But Bloodlines seems to experiment a little more, with stages being diverse locations across Europe, many that use the hardware of the Sega Genesis to its advantage. And I think Eric is a welcome addition to the cast with his Alucard spear. You'd think that name would have lore implications or some connection to Alucard, but this still isn't clear. Bloodlines has 6 major stages, each with a mini-boss and boss, and they're exactly what you'd expect from Castlevania up to this point. And yes, Death does return to metal again. But after taking him out, John and Eric corner Elizabeth in her castle, who is a breath of fresh air considering the amount of times you face Dracula in all of these games. Okay, now she's dead. Game over, right? No? No. You continue through her castle after she's defeated while the theme of Simon is playing in the background. What a cool little moment this is. But at the end of that path, a revived Dracula awaits, complete with a makeover and different attack patterns this time around. Nice. This time he has 3 forms, with his last one being a literal devil, but John and Eric are victorious. Evil is vanquished once again. This is a side note, but I miss when games used to put the names of all the enemies in the credits. That would conclude Castlevania Bloodlines, and these 2 characters weren't one-offs. They'll become very important later on in this series. Okay, I spent a little bit more time on that game than I thought. I'm making good progress over here, right? Continue to pardon the dust. But quick advertisement for the channel, I do have a Patreon now. If you really enjoy this type of content, it's $2 a month, and you get behind the scenes access to the channel, ad-free videos, etc, etc. I would absolutely welcome your support. Thank you so much for watching regardless. So up to this point, Konami is really churning out Castlevania games. There's practically one like every year, which leads me to believe they were cracking the vampire killer at these devs to get these out quickly. And it didn't matter if the directors left, they'd just find a new team to handle the next one. I guess we were lucky that we had such talented developers on the job. But after Bloodlines and Dracula X, the gaming industry was shifting. Sega and Nintendo were moving towards supporting the 3D plane with the Sega Saturn and N64, while Sony entered the market with PlayStation in 1995. Toru Hagihara, the director of Rondo of Blood, was already at work on their next Castlevania title, which is being developed for Sega's 32X. This peripheral for the Genesis that supported full 3D, it didn't really get the traction that it was meant to. But while this 32X project didn't have an official name, fans retroactively referred to it as Castlevania The Bloodletting, a direct sequel to Rondo of Blood. But the project would be abandoned due to Konami shifting their efforts to the PlayStation, and much of the team would reassemble to work on a new project known as Symphony of the Night. It's a cool evening in March of 1997, and you just picked up a copy of Symphony of the Night, the next part of the Castlevania saga. You pop it into the disc tray of the PlayStation, and you're greeted by this ominous but beautiful hymn. You put in the file name and hit start, and immediately you're controlling Richter Belmont, while being dropped into the final boss fight of a game you probably never played. And just to crank up the confusion, the screen proudly says, Final Stage Bloodlines. Wait, Bloodlines? Like the Sega Genesis game? Do I need to play that to understand this? You're confused, this is epic, you're now aware of the greatness you just purchased. So yes, the game kicks off with the final confrontation between Richter and Dracula, but this time they've moved their little chat before their fight, resulting in one of the most famous scenes in this series.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
Yeah, the translation here was a bit rough, but it carries the same sentiment. Dracula turns his blame to the evil of mankind, and the fight begins. Richter, by the way, is much more ridiculous than his Rondo of Blood form, which makes me disappointed that he didn't control this way in that game. He can slide, the whip has more flexible mechanics similar to Super Castlevania 4, he has this crazy slide kick, and the vampire killer has this ethereal glow that gives it this mystical feel. But the fight is exactly the same as Rondo of Blood, and there's no way for you to lose in this case. Even if Richter loses all of his health, Maria will make a cameo and make him invincible. Check out this PlayStation flex right here going on in the background. But make no mistake, this game was a direct sequel to Rondo of Blood, with the Japanese version keeping the Akumajo Dracula X name, subtitled Gekka no Yasokyoku, or Nocturne in the Moonlight. So whoever localized the subtitle to Symphony of the Night deserves a raise. Now that you're caught up, we get a Star Wars style intro mentioning that 4 years have passed and Richter suddenly went missing, with Maria setting out to look for him. To make matters worse, Dracula's castle suddenly appears again in a short amount of time. And while this is happening, it confirms that Alucard, who has been sleeping all of this time to purge the world of his bloodline, is now awake after sensing the return of evil. I guess he was tired of all these Belmonts not getting the job done permanently. So the game kicks off with his homecoming. Hell yeah. The game begins with Alucard racing into the castle, powering his way through that familiar entranceway. And as the player defeats enemies, they may notice a mechanic that hasn't been around since Simon's Quest: leveling up. Instead of collecting hearts though, all you need to do is defeat enemies, with Alucard packing several stats that increase, which now gives an incentive to fight off monsters. So after clearing the entranceway, Alucard has a run-in with Death, who kindly asks him to stop this attack, to which he replies,
I will not.
So instead of fighting him, Death takes all of Alucard's shit. All the armor and weapons you have are now gone, and you have to start from square one with whatever you can find around the castle. Welcome to Symphony of the Night. This was my first Castlevania game, and I can't tell you what about this case made me pick it out from the shelf. I just remember seeing it and just saying, that one. And I was like 8 or 9 years old. This is actually my original copy. You can even see me scribbling notes on the back page. It's interesting because the North American cover art is trash. Like, the European and Japanese cases are so much better. But I guess my inner prophet at that time told me that this game would be absolute flames.
Man, shut your bitch.
But imagine my shock and disappointment when I realized I wouldn't be playing as this absolute badass named Richter at the beginning of the game. I was so confused as to why they let me play as him and gave me a taste of all that power before stripping it away from me and having me play as Alucard, and then strip it away further by having Death take away all of his good equipment. Little did I know, by the end of the game, all of that gear was trash anyway. There are better ways to break Alucard. Symphony of the Night is unlike any other Castlevania game made before it. Dracula's castle is essentially one huge map that you can explore. Gone is the linear stage-by-stage gameplay from previous titles. Everything is here for you to go at your own pace and investigate. If you can't access one part of the castle now, you'll eventually find an ability or an item that will allow you to get there later. You can backtrack as you please. And Castlevania didn't invent this formula. Metroid, more specifically Super Metroid, already implemented the concept of having Samus explore a massive world and be able to find items or gear so she can backtrack and gain access to previously unavailable areas. But Symphony of the Night polished that formula, so well in fact, while incorporating RPG elements, that it would go on to define a genre famously called Metroidvania. It's one of the few video game genres out there strictly named after the games that defined it. The only other one I can think of off the top of my head is Souls-like, named after the Dark Souls series, or Demon Souls if you want to get specific. So throughout the game, you control Alucard in his quest to figure out what's going on in his former home, defeating enemies and bosses while collecting items and gear that will make him strong enough to continue through the castle. In addition to his stats that are typical of RPGs like strength, luck, intelligence, etc., Alucard has hit points and magic points that are always visible in the top left. Take enough damage and those hit points go to 0, and you get this animation and game over screen that had me put this game down for over a year as a kid. Why? It's not spelled out to you, but the game tracks your performance on the intro fight with Dracula, timing how quickly you defeat him and how much damage you took. The better your performance, the better Alucard's starting stats at the beginning of the game, and I love hidden mechanics like this. So as Alucard explores the castle, he runs into a familiar face. Little Maria is all grown up, and she's been running around the castle to find Richter, who's been missing for about a year at this point. So Alucard will run into her frequently as they try to piece together what's going on. And there's interesting lore introduced along the way. Like Maria telling Alucard while she's been in the castle before, it's not exactly like how it was the last time. To which Alucard explains that the castle itself is a creature of chaos, one that takes many incarnations, which explains why it's always familiar but different. After some time, Alucard will finally run into Richter in the Colosseum, but something's not right.
Open hell's gate. Come forth, my servants.
Yeah, the plot thickens. So with Richter clearly under the influence of something, it's up to Alucard and Maria to stop him. And in the grand scheme of things, there's not a ton of story here, as most of your time within Symphony of the Night will be exploring the castle. But as Alucard clears certain areas on the map, characters like the Master Librarian are introduced, who serves as the game's merchant, or certain important bosses like the Succubus, who cosplays as Alucard's mother to trick him into turning to the dark side. In this scene, we learn that his mother, Lisa Tepish, was burned at the stake hundreds of years ago during witch trials, with Alucard unable to stop the mob that killed her. Alucard doesn't fall for the Succubus's recreation of the scene, but this depicts an interesting change to the overall lore. Alucard is now officially half human and half vampire, being born with his vampiric powers, and not due to Dracula's pact with the devil as it was stated in Castlevania 3. So once Alucard reaches the castle keep, instead of finding Dracula, Richter is waiting instead, who states that Dracula only shows up every 100 years, and since he's already defeated him, his role as a Belmont is over. But if he resurrects him, their fight can go on for eternity. Great plan, I know, but stick with me here. This leads to a battle between the two, with Alucard actually slaying Richter.
What need for the shepherd when the wolves have all gone?
Bars. So the game ends with the destruction of the castle as Alucard overlooks from the cliffside like many before him. He reflects on the violent nature of mankind and explains Richter was no different before leaving his homeland. But this ending doesn't feel right. You mean you forgot to find the hidden holy glasses in the clock tower that allow you to clearly see that Richter has been possessed this whole time? Stupid. So before we head back into the castle, what made this game one of the greatest Castlevania games of all time? Apparently an executive at Konami went to the team and ordered them to make the ultimate Dracula game. No one knew what that meant, but while it was directed by Rondo of Blood's Toru Hagihara, he brought on board a man by the name of Koji Igarashi, or Iga for short. Believe it or not, before joining the project, Iga would work on a dating sim for Konami, known as Tokimeki Memorial, as the writer. A game that has gained newfound popularity in the West due to Action Button's 6-hour coverage of the title. If you want to know everything about it, I'm sure he's got you covered there. But while Iga worked on this game, his girlfriend at the time also worked at Konami and was on the development team for Rondo of Blood, which gave Iga the opportunity to play the game during his breaks. After his writing on Tokimeki Memorial generated good sales, that was all he needed to request a transfer to the Castlevania team. And Iga would play a huge role in giving the series a fresh start, being in charge of scenario writing and overall programming for Symphony of the Night. He said, quote, "We gave the player a lot of freedom because we wanted to lengthen the playtime for an action game, which is usually short. If people spend 5,800 yen, approximately $58 at that time, they should get 5,800 yen worth of enjoyment from it. Even when a game is very difficult, defeating enemies isn't very exciting, is it? I thought it'd be fun for players to get experience from enemies and level up, so I added RPG elements," end quote. And as development went along, Toru Hagihara would receive a promotion to head of the division and pass the baton to Iga to finish the game as its assistant director. Apparently a huge motivator for this massive design change for the series was them seeing many other previous titles sitting in bargain bins. This means people weren't holding on to their games. They were completing them and discarding them, which led to the idea of a new direction for the franchise from the get-go. Of course, Iga was directly inspired by Super Metroid, but would also take inspiration from the Legend of Zelda series as well, mostly in its dungeon design, where Link would need to find items or specific gear to be able to access deeper parts of that dungeon. So they incorporated these elements by rewarding players with new items as you explore the castle, while keeping that familiar real-time action established in previous titles. Simon's Quest kind of took a stab at this early on in the series with its major shift from all hack and slash to more exploration-based elements, which also served as inspiration to Iga. They were even considering playing around with the concept of Alucard's holy human blood and his dark vampiric side by introducing an alignment system. Hagihara said, quote, "In the early planning stages, we had an alignment system. If you used the sub-weapons a lot, you would have a holy alignment, and if you used magic a lot, you would have a dark alignment." Iga: "Yeah, and the ending would have changed based on your alignment," end quote. But revamped gameplay was just scratching the surface on this facelift. The art style would also get an update, with self-taught artist Ayami Kojima joining the team as the character designer, with Symphony of the Night being her very first game. They wanted the leading man this time to be stylish instead of the usual muscle-bound 80s action star look, and the team searched for an illustrator who hadn't done much work with games before and combed bookstores looking at book covers while researching artists. Finally, they landed on Kojima, believing her art style was the best direction for the series, and Alucard was specifically chosen as a protagonist that wielded other weapons aside from a whip. A character who had abilities that could grow and change while simultaneously being connected to the history of Castlevania. Returning from Castlevania Bloodlines was Michiru Yamane, who now had better hardware to work with on the PlayStation for music, fusing the sounds of rock, jazz, and classical styles that merged that gothic sound with modern music. An incredible amount of thought and detail was put into Symphony of the Night, a perfect storm that I could go on and on for hours about, like the 254 items that are packed into this game, Alucard's transformations that allow him to turn into Wolf, Bat, or Mist, giving the ability to access areas he couldn't before, the fighting game style combos you can put in to activate magical abilities, or the familiar system that allows you to summon a companion that will fight by your side as you traverse the castle. If you have not played this game, stop this video and go download it now and enjoy that shit. No joke. But just make sure you like the video before you leave. Okay, so instead of killing Richter, Alucard found the holy glasses this time. So when you're confronting him, we see this weird green orb above his head this time. You can actually completely ignore it still and kill Richter anyway, leading to a different cutscene with Alucard delivering the bad news to Maria, while she ponders what made him go mad in the first place. So this is the game spoon feeding to you that you need to go back and try again. But yes, clearly you attack the green orb during the fight, and it's revealed that Richter has been possessed by the ghost of Shaft, back from Rondo of Blood. And his aim, of course, is to bring back Dracula once again, just because. And in the greatest twist in this game, after you've properly traversed a majority of the castle, it's an inverted version of it that appears in the sky, leading to the next part of the game where you explore the castle once again, but now everything is upside down. So the max percentage of completion you can get in this game is 200.6%, with each castle representing 100% each. I know I mentioned the holy glasses were somewhat hidden, but this was intentionally done with Iga saying, quote, "What we were thinking is that people wouldn't defeat Dracula on the very first playthrough. We wanted them to defeat Richter once. Then after feeling like they'd beat Richter and cleared the game, they decided to aim for 100% completion in the normal castle, and uncover all the places they didn't get to. In doing so, they would discover the inverted castle and feel like they've found something special. When players defeated Richter, we wanted them to be wondering, what happened to Death? What about all of Alucard's stolen equipment? So after this point, the castles are your oyster, with minimal story in between. You'll be exploring, finding new items, facing new bosses, and taking the time to plan out the best equipment for Alucard to move forward. This isn't a deep dive into gameplay so much, but I will say there is plenty of gear to make Alucard literally unstoppable. But Alucard will finally catch up with Shaft, which leads to their real boss battle. And despite Alucard's efforts, the deed has been done. Shaft successfully revives Dracula, and after hundreds of years, Alucard and Dracula reunite.
Father.
Well met, my son. It's been a long time.
And in this conversation, Dracula reminds Alucard how despicable humans are, still angry over what they did to Lisa Tepish, which is a slight change to the lore established in Castlevania 3, giving Dracula his motivation for hating humans in general. After unsuccessful attempts to recruit Alucard to his side, they face off, with Dracula now an abomination. But I love the design of this thing. A mix and match of everything demonic, with Dracula just sitting on a throne in the middle. This is great. But after a hard fight, Alucard slays his father once again.
Tell me, what were Lisa's last words?
She said, "Do not hate humans. If you cannot live with them, then at least do them no harm, for theirs is already a hard lot." She also said to tell you that she would love you for all of eternity.
Lisa, forgive me. Farewell, my son.
And so the castle crumbles, and for the first time in the Castlevania series, it seems like Dracula has a small change of heart, until he's revived again by Elizabeth in Bloodlines later in the timeline. But with the day saved, Alucard meets with Richter and Maria at the end, with Richter feeling remorseful that he wasn't much help this time, saying it must have been hard for Alucard to take down his own father. To which Alucard responds,
"Indeed, but you must always remember that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing."
Alucard chooses to lock his cursed blood away again, implying that he'd return to deep sleep, and depending on how much of the map you explored, Maria might opt to go after him, saying that she can't let him disappear from her life. "Madam, you've known this man for one night, and you're how old again?" So we see her run after him, and the credits roll, ending what I think is still arguably the best game of the series. But if you haven't had enough, after you beat the game, you can put Richter's name as the file name to unlock him as a playable character. My dream of using him throughout the entire game was answered, but I remember by the time I got here, I didn't really care anymore. What happens to Maria and Richter after this is unclear, as it closes out their stories, but Ego was asked about what may have happened to everyone after Symphony of the Night concluded. He said, quote, "I did have deeper and more involved dialogue planned, but I thought it would interrupt the game progression too much, so we took it out. There were many characters who had to be cut, but the ones I still wish we could have added were Elizabeth Bathory and Gilles de Rais, another serial child murderer in France during the time of Joan d'Arc. As for post-game stories, Alucard and Maria's whereabouts are unknown. Richter uses this as an opportunity to pass the vampire killer to the Morris family, who are relatives of the Belmonts. He disappears with Annette. And after this, the reputation of the Belmont name as vampire hunters vanishes from history. However, that doesn't mean the Belmont bloodline has died out, so perhaps they'll rise again as vampire hunters someday." End quote. Interestingly enough, Konami would follow up with Richter, Maria, and Alucard in 2008 with an internet radio drama exclusive to Japan called Akumajo Dracula X, Suioku no Yasukyoku, or Nocturne of Recollection. It takes place just a year after, when an incubus named Magnus tries to bring Alucard to the dark side, which leads to the gang getting back together again to defeat Magnus. And I'm not sure if anyone considers this little story canon, given the format and its limited release. But while Symphony of the Night is known as the quintessential Castlevania game and received extremely positive initial reception, it didn't sell very well at the start. But because of the praise from these critics, word of mouth truly pushed sales in the United States, with the game selling a little over 700,000 copies on its initial run. A year later, it'd be ported to the Sega Saturn by a separate Konami team, including Maria as a fully playable character, new bosses, new areas in the castle like Cursed Prison and Underground Garden, and additional music tracks. But despite all the new features, performance-wise, the PlayStation version is considered the superior version. Ego would even mention the Saturn version in an interview with Play magazine in 2007, saying, quote, "I understand why fans who've never played the Saturn version would be interested in those features, but I really don't feel good about them. I couldn't put my name on that stuff and present it to Castlevania fans." So at this stage, it seemed like Konami had a working formula for Castlevania with Symphony of the Night. But there were a few other projects in the works at the same time that would release shortly after. The first was Castlevania Legends, developed for the Game Boy in November of 1997 in Japan, and March 1998 in North America. I mentioned before that Bloodlines was the last classic Castlevania, but
the lie detector determined that was a lie.
Legends goes back to the very beginning of the timeline, predating Trevor and the gang's run-in with Dracula, this time starring Sonia Belmont, the earliest ancestor of the Belmont clan up to this point. So while this game has minimal story, the Japanese manual sheds some light on the events that lead into this title, with Sonia being from a remote mountain village in Transylvania, living alongside her grandfather. And she's born with the ability to sense spiritual beings, with her grandfather giving her a "with great power comes great responsibility" speech. So the year is 1450, and a 17-year-old Sonia actually will meet Alucard in this time, who's searching for his father who he'd never really met, which seems to fit more with their relationship in Symphony of the Night, with Alucard being closer to his mother Lisa. So Sonia and Alucard start hanging out, and it's definitely implied to have become a thing, until suddenly Count Dracula attacks, and during his assault, Sonia's grandfather is mortally wounded, telling her now's the time to use her power. She takes up his whip and sets out to get revenge on Dracula. So Sonia goes on this adventure across 6 traditional stages to put a stop to this, which leads to this awkward, potentially post-one-night stand confrontation between her and Alucard, who also wishes to stop his father, but insists it's his problem to deal with, which leads to a short fight, and after testing Sonia, he says, "Okay, I guess you're strong enough, my beloved. I'm going to sleep. We probably won't meet again, my beautiful vampire hunter." Okay, so the implications are really building up here. So after this encounter, Sonia goes on to fight Dracula, who once defeated monologues about how he'll always come back again and again and again. And he definitely wasn't lying about that. So the game ends with Sonia as the victor and going on to become a mother with her child, heavily implied to be Trevor Belmont, saying he will carry on the Belmont family name and the bloodline of dark ways? What does that mean? A child burdened with a curse? Is Alucard the daddy? It's just fun to look at all these implications to the lore here, because imagine in Castlevania 3, Trevor is running around with his own dad the whole time without knowing, and plays a part in killing his grandfather, and the Belmont clan having vampire blood from this point on. Castlevania Legends isn't mentioned much in the grand scheme of things for a few reasons. It's a Game Boy title that came out pretty late in the life of the Game Boy, while also receiving negative reception from critics for being short and boring. And poor Sonia here would be later removed from the timeline, as Ego would officially claim that Legends was non-canon, so that they could make room for another Belmont ancestor that we'll get to next video. So the first and only official female Belmont that we know of was erased. But also in 1997, another team at Konami, based in Kobe, Japan, was working on yet another Castlevania title, one that would show love to Nintendo's new console at that time, the Nintendo 64. This is just called Castlevania, released in January of 1999, and is commonly referred to as Castlevania 64 to differentiate it in the West, but in Japan, it was known as Akumajo Dracula Moku Shiroku, translating to Demon Castle Dracula Apocalypse. This would be the very first fully 3D game in the series, this time starring 2 protagonists, Carrie Fernandez, a girl with magic powers, and Reinhard Schneider, heir to the Belmont throne and the owner of the vampire killer in this time. I always find this game fascinating because it feels so removed and different from the other games up to this point. So Dracula reawakens in this time, 100 years after Symphony of the Night, in the year 1852, because humans are still eviling. Carrie and Reinhard sense this and head to his castle to stop him again. And he kindly greets them at the front of the castle, telling them all who oppose the Dark Lord will die. But despite that warning, they head in anyway, and there are various other characters roaming the castle that they'll run into along the way. Like Charles Vincent, an older vampire hunter, Rosa, a vampiress who doesn't wish to be one, and a young boy named Malice, who seems to be under the influence of Dracula. And as you roam around the castle, there are different events depending on the character you picked, like Reinhardt falling for Rosa here, trying to stop her from using light to vaporize herself, or Carrie running into a witch named Actrice, who's attempting to fully revive Dracula. All of these events are spread out as you explore the fully 3D castle, and despite it moving away from the traditional 2D gameplay, this was a huge shift for Castlevania, and it definitely had some growing pains. It's still an action platformer at heart, but now you've got a full range of movement, a lock-on system to keep your eyes on enemies, and a blend of melee and long-range attacks depending on who you're playing with. Reinhardt's got the classic Belmont whip and dagger for up-close fights, while Carrie can launch homing magic rings from afar. Great for aerial enemies, but not so great for fast ones that outrun her shots. Sub-weapons make a return too, like the cross, axe, knife, and holy water, only now they're powered by red jewels instead of hearts. And the shift to 3D does affect the Castlevania feel, with this looking more like a survival horror title like Resident Evil, with these tight corridors in the castle and sequences where you're being chased by enemies you can't fight. Despite the game being much more linear than Symphony of the Night, there is a factor of exploration, and it seems to pad this out by not providing you with a map. You're gonna have to get familiar with each section of the castle on your own. And building on the groundwork of Simon's Quest, there is a full day and night cycle that uses an in-world clock system, which means you'll need to keep tabs on this to move certain sections of the game along, and how fast you beat the game does affect the ending. So as I mentioned before, a totally different team than Iga's Dream Team worked on this title, and it was revealed to the world at Tokyo Game Show in 1997, codenamed Dracula 3D. Apparently there were a total of 4 planned playable characters, including Cornell, a werewolf that would have used martial arts to fight at close range. Multiplayer was also planned early on in development with a fighting mode, but based on this interview, it's clear that they didn't get too far into development before it was scrapped. Also, due to time constraints, they had to cut the character selection down to Carrie and Reinhardt. As you can see, the art style deviated from Ayami Kojima's Baroque art style and shifted to a more anime form, with animator Yasuomi Umetsu being in charge of the art. Umetsu is known for the film Kite and the Mezzo series, gritty adult thriller animations from the late 90s. As far as the characters Carrie and Reinhardt, they do have some connections to the previous games. It's explicitly said Reinhardt is a Belmont descendant, but that's about it for him. Carrie, on the other hand, is pretty interesting because she has the last name Fernandez, which in Japanese is Verunandez, which is the same last name as Sypha from Castlevania 3. Initially, Verunandez was potentially mistranslated as Belnades, so instead of sticking to that last name in English, they chose to properly translate it this time to Fernandez. All that to say, Carrie is a proper descendant of the Belnades clan. But these two get unique plot points as they progress further into the castle, leading up to Reinhardt being forced to fight Rosa after death pits her against him. Meanwhile, Carrie is forced to fight her cousin, a fellow Fernandez Belnades warrior, whatever you want to call them, who, fun fact, was initially planned to be a revived Sypha herself. So after these emotion-filled battles, Reinhardt and Carrie will fight Death and Actrice respectively. Reinhardt is on the ropes from Death's onslaught, but is saved by Rosa, who jumps in the way of his sights to save him, with Reinhardt now vowing to get revenge on Death and Dracula himself. Meanwhile, Actrice, or is it Actress, tries to convince Carrie to join their side, revealing she killed her own child in exchange for eternal life, to which Carrie calls her pathetic for that and makes quick work of her. So with Actrice or Death slain, depending on the character you picked, it's now time to face Dracula in the castle keep. And after being defeated, he angrily curses the player before just exploding. But is that it? Where's the second form? Well, in his defeat, the castle begins to fall apart, but during your escape, Malice suddenly shoots an arrow at you while riding in on a black unicorn Pegasus thing. At that point, the character senses a deep darkness within him, and it's revealed that Malice was the reincarnation of Dracula this whole time. That guy earlier was just some guy. Okay, more specifically, he was Gilles de Rais, this game's depiction of that serial killer I mentioned earlier, which is a cool little twist. But cat's out of the bag for Malice, who now shows his true form. Oh, look at that. Dracula is now a hottie.
Oh no, he's hot!
So this is the real boss fight, with Dracula just teleporting around and him firing flames at you, but with enough hits, he's destroyed, and Malice is released, not remembering a thing that happened. Just kidding. Vincent throws holy water on him, and he starts burning, showing that Dracula is just playing games. That's when he takes on his true form, this dragon centipede. I'll accept it, since Dracula literally means dragon, so I see what they were going for here. But Dracula is fully vanquished and peace returns to the land, with the game ending with Carrie visiting the grave of her stepmother and Reinhardt managing to somehow revive Rosa and restore her humanity. And they run off to have Belmont X vampire babies. For what it's worth, Castlevania 64 was an interesting experiment and was heavily overshadowed by Symphony of the Night. Even still, they would build on the basis of the game with a prequel expansion that was released in December of 1999, known as Legacy of Darkness. This time, they had 4 playable characters like they originally planned. Remember Cornell, that character they scrapped? He's featured as the main character this time, with the game taking place 8 years before Castlevania 64. Cornell has these man-beast powers and is attempting to find his adoptive sister, Ada, to avoid her being sacrificed to resurrect Dracula. He'll encounter the Oldry family, whose master was turned into a vampire by Gilles de Rais, an actrice, with Cornell saving the master's son, Henry, who can be unlocked as a playable character within this expansion. Then later Cornell will run into his rival, Ortega, also a man-beast, who has joined Team Dracula. But after Cornell gets through all the shenanigans to save his sister, he has to sacrifice his man-wolf powers to do so. And it's revealed that that was the sacrifice Dracula needed all along to be revived, smoothly leading into Carrie and Reinhardt's quest years later. And this segment of the game ends with Cornell, Ada, and Henry ready for a fresh start. Now you can play as Henry with his part of the story taking place 8 years later. While Carrie and Reinhardt fight Dracula, his mission is a race into the castle to find missing children before time runs out. It's more of a time attack mode than anything else, but a cool addition to an already packed game. With all of that said, I don't have strong opinions about Castlevania 64 or Legacy of Darkness. I just like the fact it was different, and it's an ambitious attempt to take the series into 3D, even though Symphony of the Night perfected and built on the classic games. These titles just kind of are their own thing. And once Koji Igarashi sat at the helm of the entire Castlevania series as producer, he made them non-canon to the mainline titles. Iga has clarified that they were mainly taken out of the timeline because the directors of the games always considered these to be side projects. So with Castlevania Symphony of the Night getting such high praise, Konami would attempt to consolidate the series into that format as we get into the early 2000s, with Iga becoming the captain of the Castlevania ship. So next time we'll be covering the games under Iga's full leadership, complete with additional Belmonts and games that covered the earliest and latest points in the Castlevania timeline. I feel like I bit off a little bit more than I can chew in this series, to be honest, but we're getting through it. So join me next time as we continue through Mentoktober, the Castlevania edition. A huge shout out to my members on YouTube and patrons on Patreon for their contributions to the channel. Bonnie, Carla D, The Cold One, The New Kid on the Block, Randy Whitmore, Anapan, Yamans Graves, Clank Samakun, and Kenny Lauderdale. I'll see you all next time.